Caroline Carter entered the world on a quiet morning that was meant to be ordinary. Instead, it ended in loss. Her mother never came home from the hospital. What the doctors called sudden post-delivery complications sounded clinical and distant, words that carried no comfort and offered no explanation a newborn could ever understand. By the time Caroline was placed in her father's arms, the room had already changed. The air felt thinner. The future had shifted without warning. Michael Carter had loved his wife deeply. He had imagined a life that made sense. Work, home, shared routines, a child growing between them. When she died, that vision collapsed. He stood at the edge of his daughter's crib and felt nothing but panic. He was not cruel or indifferent. He was simply undone. Grief hollowed him out, and fear filled the space it left behind. He did not know how to hold a newborn without trembling. He did not know how to speak to her, how to soothe her, how to begin. Margaret Carter did not hesitate. She arrived with quiet certainty, the kind that comes from having lived long enough to know when questions no longer matter. She took Caroline from the hospital and brought her to her small rural home in Pennsylvania, where the land stretched wide and familiar, and neighbors still waved from across gravel roads. Margaret did not make speeches or promises. She unpacked bottles, folded blankets, and began. In that house, life moved gently. Mornings came with the sound of a kettle and the soft creak of floorboards. Evenings ended with lamplight and low voices. Margaret spoke to Caroline constantly, not because she expected answers, but because words mattered. She explained the world as it unfolded, the change of seasons, the names of birds, the reason rain sounded different on the porch roof than it did on the windows. Caroline learned to trust that voices did not disappear without reason. The absence of a mother was never hidden, but it was never made heavy. When Caroline was old enough to ask, Margaret answered carefully. She said Caroline's mother had been very sick, that her body could not recover, and that sometimes love does not get enough time. She did not describe pain or fear. She did not allow the story to become something that haunted. Instead, she spoke of love as something that had existed fully, even if briefly. Caroline accepted this without tears. There was no sense of abandonment, only a quiet gap she did not yet know how to name. Michael visited when he could. He brought gifts chosen with care and an awkward tenderness that never quite reached its mark. He held Caroline stiffly, spoke politely, and left too soon. Margaret watched without judgment. She understood that grief could paralyze as easily as it could destroy. She did not push her son to be more than he was capable of being. For Caroline, she was enough. As Caroline grew, her world remained small and safe. Margaret was constant, always there in the mornings, always waiting in the afternoons. She attended school events, listened to long stories that wandered without purpose, and answered questions no adult should ever dismiss. When Caroline woke from bad dreams, Margaret sat beside her bed until sleep returned. Trust was not taught. It was lived. There was warmth in that house that did not announce itself. It existed in routine, in patience, in the certainty that someone would always be there. Caroline learned to move through her days without fear. She learned that mistakes were allowed, that questions were welcome, and that silence did not mean distance. Margaret became her compass, her anchor, her entire emotional universe. Somewhere beneath that safety, the loss remained. It did not ache. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, like a shadow that never moved closer or farther away. Caroline did not miss what she had never known, but the knowledge of absence shaped her quietly. It made her observant. It made her careful with affection. It made her deeply loyal to the one person who had never failed her. In that rural house, surrounded by steady love, Caroline learned what it meant to belong. She did not yet know how fragile that belonging was, or how much it would matter later. For now, there was only trust and the unspoken belief that the world at its core was a safe place. Michael Carter returned to the sea not long after Caroline's birth. as if distance were the only place where his grief could breathe. He worked long rotations as a marine mechanic, weeks at a time on vessels that moved steadily while his life on land remained unresolved. The work was demanding and physical, the kind that left little room for reflection. When he was gone, money arrived on schedule. When he was home, time did not. His visits followed a pattern. He came with luggage still smelling faintly of salt and engine oil, with gifts chosen carefully and conversations prepared in advance. He asked Caroline how school was going, whether she was eating well, whether she listened to her grandmother. His voice was polite, measured, and distant. He stayed a few days, sometimes a week if his schedule allowed, then left again with a brief embrace that ended too soon. Caroline watched him the way children learn to watch adults, quietly, attentively, without accusation. She noticed how his hands hesitated when he reached for her, how his eyes drifted to the window when the conversation slowed. He never raised his voice, never showed irritation, but he also never lingered. It was as if her presence reminded him of something he could not face, something he had learned to survive by keeping at arm's length. Margaret tried at first to close the distance. She invited Michael to stay longer, suggested small outings, encouraged him to take Caroline with him when he went to town. She spoke gently, never with blame, reminding him that children did not wait forever to be known. Michael listened, nodded, and promised to try. Then the next rotation came, and nothing changed. Over time, Margaret stopped pressing, not because she had given up, but because she understood the cost of forcing a connection that was not ready to exist. She focused instead on what she could control, on providing Caroline with consistency, patience, and a sense of belonging that did not depend on anyone else's presence. She made no excuses for her son, but she did not criticize him either. In her quiet way, she protected Caroline from disappointment by lowering expectations before they could be broken. Caroline adapted. Children often do. She learned the rhythm of her father's appearances and departures and adjusted her feelings accordingly. She stopped running to the door when she heard a car pull into the drive. She stopped saving stories to tell him, knowing there might not be time. When he asked how she was doing, she answered simply. When he hugged her goodbye, she did not hold on. It was not anger that shaped this change, but awareness. Caroline sensed his discomfort long before she could name it. She understood that affection made him uneasy, that closeness asked something of him he could not give. Without being told, she learned to step back. She learned not to ask for reassurance, not to expect warmth that was never offered. It was easier to accept distance than to wonder why it existed. Margaret noticed the shift and felt it deeply. She watched Caroline grow more self-contained, more careful with her emotions. There were moments when she considered intervening again, when she imagined calling Michael and insisting he try harder. Each time, she chose restraint. Caroline deserved honesty, not forced gestures that would disappear as soon as the ship pulled away from shore. The house remained warm, but something subtle changed. The openness of Caroline's early childhood gave way to quiet restraint. She became observant, thoughtful, quick to read the mood of a room. She learned to be content with what was offered and to make up the rest for herself. Love, she discovered, could be steady without being loud. Absence, when predictable, could be managed. Michael continued to provide. He paid for everything Caroline needed and more. He fulfilled his responsibilities without complaint. From the outside, there was nothing to criticize. But connection is not measured in transactions, and presence cannot be scheduled around departure dates. By the time Caroline reached school age, she no longer waited for her father to change. She accepted him as he was, someone who supported her life without truly entering it. It was not a lesson she was ever taught aloud. It was one she learned by watching, and once learned, it stayed with her. Arthur Bennett lived across the road, in a modest house that had once been shared with a wife who was gone far too early. He kept his place neat, his yard trimmed, and his routine steady. In a town where everyone noticed everyone else, Arthur was known as kind, quiet, and dependable. He waved when he passed Margaret's porch, helped when help was needed, and never asked for more than a brief conversation. It was during Caroline's birthday gathering that Arthur first noticed something different. The celebration was simple: neighbors, a few folding tables, homemade food laid out under the open sky. Laughter drifted across the yard, unforced and familiar. Someone brought out an old guitar, more as a novelty than a plan, and strummed a few careless chords. The sound wavered, uneven and playful. Caroline, standing nearby with a paper plate in her hands, stopped moving, her head tilted slightly, eyes focused not on the player but on the sound itself. When the song shifted, she adjusted instinctively, humming a note that matched the new key without hesitation. It was barely audible, easy to miss. Arthur did not miss it. He listened closely as the guitar continued. Caroline hummed again, this time more confidently, her voice finding the melody without effort. There was no performance in it, no awareness of being heard. It was simply instinct. Arthur waited until the song ended before speaking. "Would you like to try?" he asked gently, offering her the guitar. Caroline hesitated. She glanced at Margaret, uncertain. Margaret smiled and nodded, the kind of encouragement that did not demand courage, but invited it. Caroline took the guitar carefully, awkwardly, holding it the wrong way at first. Arthur showed her how to turn it, how to rest it against her body. He did not rush. He did not correct, more than necessary. "Just listen," he said. "Let it tell you where to go." Her fingers found the strings, tentative at first, then steadier. She plucked one, then another, her brow furrowing in concentration. The sound was imperfect, uneven, but her timing was exact. When she sang again, her voice aligned naturally with the chords, as if she had always known where the notes belonged. The yard grew quiet. Conversations paused. Margaret watched from a few steps away, her expression softening with recognition. She had always known Caroline was attentive, observant, sensitive to rhythm and sound. She had not known it ran this deep. Arthur did not applaud when Caroline finished. He simply smiled and said, "You have a good ear." He did not call it talent. He did not promise lessons or futures. He named only what was true. From that day on, music found its way into Caroline's life without pressure or expectation. Arthur invited her over in the afternoons, showed her simple chords, taught her how to tune the guitar by listening rather than relying on tools. He never scolded mistakes. He listened more than he spoke. When Caroline struggled, he waited. When she succeeded, he nodded once, as if success were the most natural thing in the world. Margaret supported it fully. She rearranged schedules, walked Caroline across the road when needed, and sat nearby with a book while lessons unfolded. She never interrupted. She never boasted. She treated music the way she treated everything important. Quietly, respectfully, without turning it into a spectacle. For Caroline, music became a language she did not have to translate. When words felt unnecessary or confusing, sound made sense. She practiced without being told. She sang while doing chores, while walking home from school, while lying awake at night. The guitar became familiar in her hands, a steady presence that asked nothing and offered relief. Arthur began suggesting small performances, nothing formal, nothing demanding. A song at a community picnic, a few chords during a holiday gathering. Caroline agreed cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. She stood in front of neighbors who had known her since infancy and sang without fear. Her voice carried clearly, unforced, honest. Each time, something shifted inside her. People listened, not out of politeness but attention. They did not see a child who needed care or protection. They saw ability. They saw promise. They saw something worth pausing for. For the first time, Caroline felt recognized for who she was, not for what she lacked. She was not a child without a mother, not a responsibility passed between adults. She was someone who could create something beautiful, someone whose presence added rather than required. Hope emerged quietly. It did not announce itself with grand plans or expectations. It settled in as a sense of direction, a feeling that her life held purpose beyond survival. Music did not replace love or loss. It gave both a place to exist without overwhelming her. Arthur continued to guide without claiming ownership. Margaret continued to protect without restricting growth. Between them, Caroline found space to become herself. And for the first time, the future felt less like something to endure and more like something that might welcome her in return. The morning began like any other. Margaret rose early, as she always did, moving through the house with practiced familiarity. The kettle went on. The porch door opened to let in the cool air. Caroline, still half asleep, heard the sounds and felt reassured by them. Nothing in the rhythm of the day suggested it would be the last time those sounds existed. Margaret never made it back inside. Neighbors later said she had been sitting on the porch bench, one hand resting on her chest, her gaze unfocused as if she were trying to remember something important. By the time help was called, it was already too late. The heart attack was sudden and severe. Paramedics arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Margaret Carter was pronounced dead before the ambulance doors closed. Caroline learned the truth in fragments. A neighbor's voice, too gentle. Arthur Bennett, standing in the doorway, his face pale and strained. The quiet that followed words that did not make sense. For a moment, Caroline waited for someone to correct the mistake, to explain that there had been confusion, that Margaret would be back inside soon, annoyed at the fuss. That moment never came. Grief did not arrive as a wave. It settled like a weight that pressed the air out of her lungs. The house felt wrong immediately. Too large, too silent, unfamiliar in ways she could not explain. Caroline moved from room to room, touching objects Margaret had handled only hours before, as if proximity could undo reality. Arthur and the neighbors did what they could. Meals appeared on the table. Someone made sure Caroline ate, slept, drank water. Voices filled the house during the day, but they left at night, and the darkness felt unbearable. Arthur stayed longer than the others, sitting quietly answering questions only when asked. He did not try to explain what could not be explained. Michael was at sea. Calls were made. Messages were left. Caroline waited, convinced that once her father knew, something would change. He did not answer. Ships moved on their schedules, not according to grief. By the time Michael received the message and began the process of returning, arrangements had already been made. Margaret's funeral was small. Neighbors filled the pews. Arthur stood in the front row. Caroline sat beside an empty space where her father should have been. She did not cry during the service. She felt hollow, as if tears required an energy she no longer possessed. The words spoken about Margaret, her kindness, her patience, her devotion, felt both true and unbearable. Caroline had known all of it. Hearing it aloud made the loss sharper. When Michael finally returned, the house no longer felt like home. He walked through the rooms with unfamiliar caution, noticing details he had never paid attention to before. He hugged Caroline awkwardly, holding her too tightly at first, then releasing her too quickly. He apologized for not being there. The words sounded insufficient even to him. There were practical matters to address, decisions that could not be delayed. Caroline listened as adults spoke around her, using careful language that left no room for alternatives. Without Margaret, there was no arrangement that made sense. Caroline was a minor. Michael was her legal guardian. The conclusion was obvious, even if it felt impossible. Caroline understood before anyone said it aloud. She would have to leave. The realization settled slowly, then all at once. This house, the road outside, the neighbors who had known her since infancy, none of it could come with her. There was no discussion about staying, no suggestion of compromise. Michael did not ask what she wanted. He assumed necessity would override preference. Grief became something sharper then, something edged with fear. Margaret had been her world. Without her, everything else felt temporary, uncertain. Caroline did not protest. She did not argue. She lacked the strength for either. Instead, she began to detach, instinctively preparing for the next loss before it happened. On the day she packed her things, the house seemed to watch her. Arthur helped load boxes into the car, moving carefully, as if speed might shatter something fragile. He promised she could visit. He promised he would keep an eye on the house. Caroline nodded. Knowing promises did not mean permanence. As the car pulled away, Caroline looked back once. The porch was empty. The windows reflected the sky. Nothing moved. Her grief remained unfinished, suspended between what she had lost and what she was about to lose next. The world had not just changed. It had broken, and there was no time to gather the pieces before being carried somewhere else entirely. The move to the Pittsburgh suburbs happened quickly, with more efficiency than feeling. Michael believed that speed would help, that settling Caroline into a new place without delay would prevent the grief from deepening. The apartment he chose was clean and practical, close to schools and public transit, in a neighborhood that felt orderly and quiet. It was everything a responsible parent would select. It was also painfully empty. The first night, Caroline lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. Traffic in the distance, footsteps from the unit above, the steady hum of appliances she did not recognize. There were no creaking floorboards, no porch wind, no rhythm she could attach meaning to. The walls were bare. The furniture was new. Nothing carried memory. Michael tried to fill the space with provisions. He stocked the refrigerator, bought school supplies, replaced clothes that no longer fit. He asked Caroline what she needed and made lists when she answered. He woke early to make breakfast, asked about her classes in the evening, and reminded her of schedules taped neatly to the refrigerator door. From the outside, it looked like effort. From Caroline's perspective, it felt like management. Conversation remained shallow. Michael asked questions he knew how to ask and avoided the ones he did not. He did not mention Margaret unless Caroline did first. When she did, he nodded, said her name softly, and changed the subject. He was not unkind. He was careful. And careful, Caroline learned, could feel like distance when what was needed was presence. She withdrew without drama. At school, she was quiet and observant, answering when spoken to but never volunteering more than necessary. She followed instructions precisely and avoided attention. Teachers noted her politeness and left her alone. She returned home each afternoon, did her homework, and spent long stretches of time sitting on her bed, staring at nothing in particular. Music faded almost completely. The guitar remained in its case, tucked into a corner of her room. Caroline could not bring herself to open it. The thought of sound in that silent apartment felt intrusive, almost wrong. Music belonged to another place, another time. Picking up the guitar felt like admitting how much she had lost, and she was not ready for that. Weeks passed. The routines of city life began to form around her. Bus schedules, class periods, homework cycles. The predictability helped, but it did not comfort. Loneliness settled in quietly, becoming part of the background rather than an event she could point to. She spoke to Arthur once, briefly over the phone. His voice grounded her, then left her feeling hollow when the call ended. Michael noticed the change, but misread its cause. He assumed Caroline needed time and space and gave her both. When she declined invitations to join him on errands or outings, he accepted her answers without question. He believed restraint was respect. He did not see that distance, once given, was difficult to reclaim. One evening, long after the apartment had gone quiet, Caroline opened the guitar case. The movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. She lifted the instrument carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. Her fingers rested on the strings without pressing. She did not play at first. She listened to the silence, then gently plucked a single note. The sound was soft, barely audible. It did not echo. It did not fill the room. It simply existed. Something in Caroline eased. She played another note, then a chord she remembered without effort. The melody that followed was incomplete, uneven, but familiar. It did not bring comfort in the way it once had. It brought release. The tension she had been carrying loosened just enough for her to breathe. From that night on, music returned slowly, cautiously. Caroline played only when she was alone, keeping the volume low, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile. She did not tell Michael. He noticed the guitar out of its case once and said nothing. The structure of her life held. School continued. Days passed. The apartment remained quiet. Michael continued to provide. Caroline continued to adapt. The bond between them did not break, but it did not strengthen either. It existed in a narrow space defined by good intentions and unspoken grief. Loneliness persisted, not as a sharp pain, but as a steady absence. Caroline learned to carry it with her, just as she learned to carry everything else. The city had given her routine. Music had given her survival. What neither had given her was home. Michael met Linda Harris at a gathering he had almost declined to attend. It was the kind of social obligation he usually avoided. Too many unfamiliar faces, too much forced conversation. But something about that evening felt manageable. Linda noticed him first. She approached with an ease that felt unpracticed, asked thoughtful questions, listened without interrupting, and did not rush the silence when it appeared. She spoke about her life with clarity, neither oversharing nor withholding, and mentioned her daughter as a matter of fact, not a performance. Linda was attentive in a way Michael was not used to receiving. She remembered details, followed up on them, and expressed concern without drama. When she learned about Caroline, her interest did not feel obligatory. She asked about school, about hobbies, about what Caroline liked and disliked. Michael found himself talking more than he intended to, filling in gaps he usually left untouched. It felt relieving to be understood without having to explain himself fully. When Linda eventually met Caroline, she did so carefully. She did not overwhelm her with affection or questions. She greeted her warmly, commented on her posture and the way she carried herself, and said she looked thoughtful. Caroline noticed these things immediately. Linda's attention did not feel invasive. It felt precise, intentional. Ashley, Linda's daughter, was a few years older than Caroline and carried herself with confidence. She dressed with purpose, spoke easily, and seemed to move through the world without hesitation. From the beginning, she treated Caroline as someone worth including. She asked to see her room, commented on her guitar, and offered advice without condescension. She talked about clothes, hairstyles, and the unspoken rules of fitting in, sharing knowledge Caroline had never asked for, but quietly needed. For the first time since Margaret's death, the apartment felt different. There were voices in the kitchen, movement in the evenings, laughter that did not echo awkwardly against bare walls. Linda cooked meals that took time and attention. Ashley played music from her phone while doing homework at the table. Michael watched the changes unfold with visible relief. He came home earlier. He stayed in the living room longer. He smiled more easily. Linda made an effort to include Caroline in small, deliberate ways. She invited her along on errands, asked her opinion when choosing groceries, and praised her for noticing details others overlooked. She listened when Caroline spoke and remembered what she said. When Caroline mentioned missing Margaret, Linda did not deflect or grow uncomfortable. She acknowledged the loss, spoke respectfully of it, and allowed the silence that followed to exist. Ashley took Caroline shopping one afternoon, framing it as something they would do together rather than something Caroline needed. They tried on clothes that felt unfamiliar, colors and shapes Caroline had never considered for herself. Ashley explained how confidence worked, how posture changed perception, how small choices shaped how others responded. Caroline listened, absorbed, and slowly began to see herself differently. The change was subtle but undeniable. Caroline laughed more. She spent less time alone in her room. She spoke more at dinner. The guitar appeared in the living room instead of remaining hidden away. When she played, Linda listened attentively, offering encouragement without critique. Michael noticed these shifts with gratitude. He believed stability had finally found them. Trust formed naturally without effort. Linda's care appeared consistent. Ashley's presence felt supportive rather than competitive. Caroline did not feel managed or monitored. She felt noticed, chosen. The distinction mattered more than she understood at the time. For Michael, the transformation confirmed what he had hoped for but never achieved on his own. He saw Caroline engaging with life again, responding to attention he could not provide. He admired Linda's patience, her emotional fluency, her apparent understanding of children. He trusted her instincts. It felt right to let her lead where he had struggled. The household settled into a rhythm that felt whole. Weekends included shared meals and casual plans. Evenings ended with conversation rather than silence. The apartment no longer felt temporary. It felt lived in. Caroline allowed herself to believe in it. She did not question the ease with which warmth had returned. She did not analyze Linda's kindness or Ashley's confidence. She accepted what was offered, grateful for the sense of belonging she had been missing. For the first time since losing Margaret, she felt anchored again. The illusion was seamless. Nothing about it felt forced or false. It felt like healing. And because it felt earned, Caroline trusted it completely. The shift did not happen all at once. It began quietly, almost politely. In the days leading up to Michael's departure for another extended sea rotation, Linda grew more directive, more attentive to details that had never seemed to matter before. She commented on schedules, on habits, on the way Caroline moved through the apartment. None of it sounded hostile. It sounded responsible. Once Michael left, the tone changed. The first morning after his departure, Linda woke Caroline earlier than usual. Breakfast needed to be made. The kitchen should be cleaned before school. These were small requests, framed as expectations rather than orders. Caroline complied without question. She had been raised to help, to notice what needed doing. At first, she assumed it was temporary. It was not. Responsibilities multiplied quickly. Caroline became responsible for meals, for laundry, for keeping shared spaces in order. Linda spoke about structure and discipline, about teaching independence. When Caroline hesitated or asked for clarification, Linda sighed and reminded her that everyone had to contribute. Ashley, meanwhile, was excused. She had activities. She had plans. She was busy. Ashley's attitude shifted as well. The friendliness faded, replaced by impatience and thinly veiled contempt. She criticized Caroline's clothes, mocked her careful speech, rolled her eyes when Caroline spoke at the table. When Caroline tried to ignore it, Ashley escalated, pushing just far enough to provoke a reaction, then retreating into innocence when Linda appeared. Praise disappeared. Where Linda had once acknowledged effort, she now noticed only mistakes. A dish left in the sink became evidence of carelessness. A missed crumb on the counter became proof of laziness. Nothing Caroline did was sufficient, because sufficiency was no longer the goal. Music was addressed next. At first, Linda suggested Caroline practice less. The guitar was distracting. It interfered with responsibilities. When Caroline complied, Linda remarked that she seemed unfocused anyway. Eventually, the suggestion became a rule. Music was indulgent. It was unnecessary. It encouraged daydreaming and defiance. The guitar was moved out of the living room, then out of sight entirely. Caroline did not argue. She retreated further, shrinking her presence to avoid attention. She completed tasks quietly, spoke only when addressed, and learned to anticipate criticism before it arrived. When she failed to meet expectations that were never clearly defined, Linda labeled her difficult, ungrateful, lazy. These words carried weight. They were repeated often enough to sound factual. Linda documented everything. She mentioned Caroline's behavior in phone calls Michael never heard. She framed concerns as worries, complaints as observations. Caroline was emotional. Caroline was uncooperative. Caroline struggled with authority. Each statement was delivered calmly, reasonably, as if Linda were trying to help. Michael, far away and preoccupied with work, trusted what he was told. When he spoke to Caroline, his questions changed. He asked why she was causing problems, why she could not get along, why she was making things harder than they needed to be. Caroline heard the doubt in his voice and felt something close inside her. Ashley took advantage of the imbalance. She criticized Caroline openly now, confident she would not be corrected. She accused her of lying, of exaggerating, of seeking attention. When Caroline reacted, Ashley smirked and told her she was too sensitive. Linda nodded in agreement. Isolation deepened. Caroline stopped speaking about her day. She stopped asking for help. She learned that silence was safer than explanation. When Linda criticized her, Caroline apologized automatically, even when she did not understand what she had done wrong. Guilt became her default response. The emotional abuse escalated gradually, just enough to remain deniable. Linda never raised her voice. She never touched Caroline. Everything was said with composure, with concern. Outsiders would have seen discipline, structure, care. Caroline experienced control, erasure, and constant uncertainty. She internalized it all. Caroline began to believe she was the problem, that she was ungrateful for the stability Linda had provided, that her grief made her difficult, that her need for music was selfish. Each thought reinforced the next, building a narrative that left no room for resistance. Michael remained unaware. His calls were brief and infrequent. Linda positioned herself nearby during them, correcting Caroline's statements, finishing her sentences. Caroline learned to keep responses short. Anything else would be questioned later. At night, the apartment felt smaller. Caroline lay awake, listening for sounds, gauging Linda's mood by the way doors closed or cabinets were handled. She learned to move quietly, to make herself invisible. The guitar remained untouched, its absence another reminder of who she was no longer allowed to be. By the time Michael's return date approached, Caroline had changed. She spoke less. She smiled rarely. She moved through the apartment with caution, careful not to draw attention. Linda noticed and approved. Ashley noticed and mocked. The household appeared orderly. Meals were prepared. Chores were completed. Discipline was enforced. From the outside, it looked like improvement. Inside, Caroline was disappearing. The mask had not simply come off. It had been replaced with something colder, something sharper. And Caroline, conditioned by loss and longing, absorbed the blame in silence, believing that endurance was the same as strength. The first sign came quietly, almost by accident. Caroline noticed that Linda had begun locking her phone, something she had never bothered to do before. Calls were taken in the bedroom with the door closed. Texts were answered late at night. Her voice lowered, her laughter subdued, but unmistakably intimate. At first, Caroline told herself it was none of her business. Adults had private lives. She had learned that lesson early. But patterns formed quickly. A man began appearing at the apartment during Michael's absences. Linda introduced him casually as Victor Reynolds, a distant relative passing through the area. He was well-dressed, confident, and spoke with the smooth assurance of someone accustomed to being listened to. Caroline noticed how Linda's posture changed around him, how her voice softened, how her eyes followed him even when she pretended not to. Ashley did not bother pretending at all. She smirked whenever Victor appeared, exchanging knowing glances with her mother. Caroline understood then that she was the only one not meant to know. The truth revealed itself one afternoon when Caroline returned home earlier than expected. She paused in the hallway, out of sight, when she heard Linda speaking in a low, urgent tone. Victor's voice answered, calm and precise. Caroline caught fragments, legal terms she did not understand, numbers, timelines. Then she heard the words that made her chest tighten. "The farmhouse is still in the girl's name," Victor said. "But she's a minor. There are ways." Caroline did not move. She did not breathe. They were talking about Margaret's farmhouse, the house where Caroline had grown up, the only inheritance her grandmother had left her, documented and protected until Caroline reached adulthood. The place that still existed in Caroline's mind as safety, even after it had been locked and left behind. Linda spoke again, irritation creeping into her voice. "Michael will never agree. He's sentimental." "That's why he doesn't need to know yet," Victor replied. "What matters is establishing control, guardianship decisions, stability concerns." Caroline stepped back silently, her heart pounding. The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. Victor was not a relative. He was Linda's lover, and he was a lawyer. From that day forward, everything made sense. Linda's behavior toward Caroline sharpened. The criticisms became more pointed, more strategic. Caroline was not just lazy now, she was unstable. Not just quiet, withdrawn. Linda began documenting Caroline's behavior more aggressively, keeping notes, making phone calls when she thought Caroline could not hear. "She disappears for hours," Linda told someone over the phone one evening. "Won't answer messages. Very emotional. I'm worried." The truth was simpler. Caroline had gone to the public library, or taken a longer walk home to avoid the apartment, or sat in a park with her guitar case unopened, just needing space. But Linda did not need truth. She needed a narrative. Ashley joined in without hesitation. She mocked Caroline openly, accused her of lying, of acting out. When Caroline protested, Ashley laughed and told her to stop being dramatic. The message was consistent. No one would believe her. The police came one evening while Michael was still at sea. 2 officers stood at the door, polite but serious. Linda hovered nearby, wringing her hands, playing the role flawlessly. She explained that Caroline had not come home the night before, that she feared her stepdaughter was spiraling, making dangerous choices. Caroline tried to speak. She explained she had stayed with a classmate to work on a project, that she had told Linda in advance. Linda shook her head, sadly. "She's confused," Linda said softly. "She does that." The officers listened. They glanced at Caroline, noted her silence, her guarded posture. To them, it looked like a troubled teenager and a concerned guardian. The welfare check was logged. No action taken, but the impression remained. From that moment on, Caroline understood the danger she was in. Her credibility was gone. Anything she said could be framed as instability. Any resistance could be labeled rebellion. Linda had built a quiet case against her, brick by brick, using patience and precision. Victor's visits became more frequent. Documents appeared on the kitchen table. Linda spoke openly now, no longer bothering to hide her intentions. The farmhouse was wasted, she said. It cost money. It served no purpose. Selling it would secure Ashley's future. Tuition. Opportunities. Caroline realized then that this had never been about discipline, or family, or concern. It was about property, control, money. She was being erased, not just emotionally, but legally, and there would be no undoing it if Linda succeeded. The stakes had shifted from survival to permanence. Caroline was no longer just enduring cruelty. She was standing at the edge of something irreversible, watching the last piece of her grandmother's legacy being quietly stripped away, while the adults around her smiled and called it responsibility. Michael installed the cameras with a clear purpose in mind, and it had nothing to do with suspicion. He told himself it was about accountability, about understanding what was really happening in his home while he was gone. Linda had sounded increasingly exhausted during their calls. Caroline, increasingly distant. The stories did not align, and Michael assumed, without admitting it, that his daughter was acting out. He wanted proof, something objective, something that would quiet his doubts and allow him to correct Caroline's behavior once and for all. The cameras were small, professionally installed, hidden in common areas under the pretense of security upgrades. Michael watched the live feed from his phone late at night, between shifts, expecting minor infractions. Missed chores, attitude, evidence that Linda was right. What he saw instead hollowed him out. The first recording showed Caroline in the kitchen before dawn, moving carefully, silently. She cooked breakfast, cleaned, packed lunches that were not hers. Linda entered later, inspected the counters, and criticized the result without acknowledgement of effort. Caroline apologized reflexively, her voice barely audible. Another clip showed Ashley lounging on the couch while Caroline scrubbed the floors. When Caroline paused to rest, Ashley mocked her. Linda watched without intervening. When Caroline tried to speak, Linda shut her down with a look. Michael felt unease tighten in his chest. Then came the footage he had never imagined. Linda standing inches from Caroline, her voice low and sharp, calling her ungrateful, lazy, a burden. Caroline stood still, eyes fixed on the floor, absorbing every word. No yelling, no dramatic gestures, just calculated cruelty delivered with calm precision. Michael watched his daughter shrink. He rewound. He watched again, and again. The recordings continued. Linda speaking to Victor openly, laughing as they discussed the farmhouse. Ashley bragging about tuition, about how everything would be easier once the old place was sold. Victor explaining legal options, guardianship pathways, loopholes. There was no ambiguity, no misunderstanding. Every accusation Caroline had made, every one Michael had dismissed, played out in high definition. Michael felt something break inside him. The affair was undeniable. The manipulation was systematic. The plan to sell Margaret's farmhouse without his knowledge was detailed and deliberate. And through it all, Caroline was treated not as a child, but as an obstacle. Guilt hit first, heavy, suffocating. He remembered every time Caroline had tried to speak and he had cut her off. Every moment he had chosen Linda's calm explanations over his daughter's trembling honesty. He had handed control of his child to someone who saw her as leverage. Rage followed close behind. Michael ended his shift early. Then he did something he had not done in years. He broke contract. He informed his supervisor he was returning immediately. Penalties be damned. Nothing mattered more than getting home. The flight felt endless. Each hour away from Caroline felt like a betrayal renewed. He replayed the footage obsessively, memorizing details, steadying himself with the truth. When he arrived at the apartment, he did not call ahead. Linda opened the door with a smile that faltered instantly. Ashley froze mid-sentence. Caroline, standing in the hallway, went still, confusion flashing across her face. Michael did not raise his voice. He told Linda he knew everything. He told her to pack her things. He told Victor, who arrived later, unaware of what had changed, that he would be hearing from an attorney. He told Ashley nothing at all. Linda protested, cried, accused. Michael did not engage. The illusion had shattered too completely for repair. When the door finally closed behind them, the apartment was silent. Michael turned to Caroline. For the first time in years, he did not speak as a provider or an authority. He spoke as a father. "I'm sorry," he said. And Caroline, exhausted beyond words, believed him. The truth had been recorded. There was no denying it now. And in the wreckage of betrayal and guilt, clarity finally emerged. Sharp, undeniable, and irreversible. Linda and Ashley left the apartment that same evening. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations. Michael stood by the door while they gathered their things, his presence firm and immovable. Linda attempted explanations, then accusations, then tears. None of it changed anything. Michael did not argue. He did not justify himself. The evidence had stripped away every illusion, and with it any need for debate. Victor was barred from further contact. Within days, Michael met with an attorney, one not connected to anyone Linda knew. The farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania was secured legally and irrevocably in Caroline's name. Additional protections were added. Trusts were clarified. Guardianship limitations were documented. Nothing about Margaret's legacy would ever again be open to interpretation or exploitation. These steps were taken quietly, methodically, without fanfare. Caroline watched from the edges of it all. She did not feel triumph. There was no sense of victory, no release of anger. What she felt instead was a deep, bone-level exhaustion. The crisis had passed, but its weight remained. She moved through the apartment cautiously, half expecting the old patterns to reassert themselves. Silence still made her tense. Michael noticed. He did not demand forgiveness. He did not rush her healing. He began instead with consistency. He stayed. He adjusted his work permanently, refusing future long-term sea rotations. The decision cost him financially, but he did not frame it as a sacrifice. He framed it as a correction. When he apologized, he did so without defensiveness. He acknowledged every failure, the times he had dismissed her, the moments he had chosen comfort over curiosity, the trust he had placed in the wrong person. He named the harm directly without minimizing it. Caroline listened. She did not interrupt. She did not cry. She accepted the apology slowly, not as an event, but as a process. Healing did not arrive all at once. Music returned first, not as performance, but as refuge. Caroline took the guitar out of its case one evening and played quietly, not to impress or escape, but simply to feel something familiar again. Michael listened from another room, careful not to intrude. When she finished, he did not comment. He understood that some things were not meant to be spoken into yet. Gradually, routine softened. Meals were shared without obligation. Conversations extended past logistics. Michael learned how to ask questions without steering the answers. Caroline learned that silence no longer carried consequences. They returned to the farmhouse together months later. The house was exactly as Caroline remembered, still patient, waiting. Dust had settled. Time had passed, but the walls held. The land remained. It was not just property. It was proof that something good had survived. Standing there, Caroline did not feel grief as sharply as she once had. She felt presence. Margaret's care lingered in the structure of the place, in the choices that had protected it even after her death. Caroline began to plan, not urgently, not ambitiously, but thoughtfully. Music classes resumed. Performances were considered, not demanded. Trust rebuilt in small increments, reinforced by reliability rather than promises. Michael changed, too. He listened more than he spoke. He paid attention to discomfort. He learned to read the quiet signals he had once ignored. Fatherhood became less about provision and more about presence. The past was not erased. It did not need to be. What mattered was that it no longer dictated the future. There was no revenge, no public reckoning, no dramatic closure. There was safety, there was accountability, and there was a father who finally saw his child, not as a responsibility to manage, but as a person to protect. That was enough.